I'm sure that all members are familiar with the rules and regulations that go with hybrid format, so I'm declining to read them all, and we'll get right down to business. We have two witnesses for our opening first hour, Dr. Jolicoeur and Eor Mikulishin. I understand, Mr. Mikulishin, you're going to go first, and then followed by Jolicoeur. You have, Professor Jolicoeur, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the committee for the invitation. I'm here on behalf of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, where I'm the executive director. Our organization is the Federation of National, Provincial, and Local Ukrainian Organizations in Canada. We work to coordinate and represent the interests of our community, which at the last census was tallied at just under 1.4 million Canadians. We've been active since 1940, and we work in a number of spheres, including on defense policy. As members of parliament will know, in February 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine. Since 2014, Russia has occupied Crimea, parts of the eastern Ukrainian oblasts of Donetsk and Luhansk, and prosecuted a war in eastern Ukraine where over 13,000 people have been killed and 1.5 million have been internally displaced within Ukraine. In November of this past year, Russia once more has intensified its troop movements near the Ukrainian border or borders. A series of diplomatic discussions in the past few weeks between the United States, NATO, Ukraine, and Russia has yielded no concrete results nor commitments from Russia to de-escalate its aggression against Ukraine. The UCC and the Ukrainian Canadian community believe strongly that now is the time to act to further deter a Russian invasion of Ukraine, rather than wait until it happens. We feel the most effective way to deter a Russian invasion is to take solid proactive actions rather than reactive steps. In the recent weeks, United States, United Kingdom, Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, the Czech Republic, and most recently yesterday, Denmark, have all agreed to supply defensive weapons to Ukraine's armed forces in response to Russia's escalation to Ukraine. We note and welcome the extension and expansion of Operation Unifier, Canada's military training mission in Ukraine, which was announced by the Prime Minister on January 26th. In the long term, the extension and expansion of this critical mission will strengthen Ukraine's defenses. However, the threat of an immediate Russian invasion grows every day, and the Ukrainian armed forces need our assistance now. Ukraine is under severe threat of increased Russian aggression and needs these weapons now. Ukrainians are not asking anyone to fight for them, but they do need our help to defend their country against a colonial power seeking their destruction. We understand that the government of Ukraine has requested from the government of Canada these defensive weapons for a number of weeks. Secondly, on sanctions. Stronger sanctions will help deprive the Russian state of revenue with which to continue to wage a war and finance its troop movements, and will reinforce a message to the Russian government that the West is resolute in countering Russian aggression. The Ukrainian Canadian Congress urges this committee to support the provision of defensive weapons and the strengthening of sanctions against the Russian Federation. We know that the Canadian people overwhelmingly support this provision of weapons. We conducted a survey just last week where 3 in 4 Canadians were supportive or open to Canada providing defensive weapons to Ukraine, and 42% explicitly supported this provision of weapons, which outnumbers the number of Canadians opposed, who were 23%. I'd also make note that in the 2017 report of this committee, it was noted that the government of Canada should provide lethal weapons to Ukraine to protect its sovereignty from Russian aggression. No significant Canadian sanctions have been implemented since March 2019, when 114 individuals and 15 entities were sanctioned for aggressive actions against Ukraine. And in the intervening 32 months, both the United States and the European Union have greatly expanded their sanctions against Russian officials and entities much more broadly than Canada has. So in summary, we're making 2 major recommendations to this committee to all members of Parliament to support the provision of defensive weapons to Ukraine by Canada as soon as possible, and to support the strengthening of Canadian sanctions against Russia for its increased aggression against Ukraine. Thank you.
Mr. Mikulishin, We now turn to Professor Pierre Jolicoeur from the Royal Military College of Canada. Welcome to the committee, sir. You have 5 minutes.
Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor, and thanks to the member of the committee for inviting me to testify here today. I'm not going to repeat the background information that was presented by the previous witness. I share his point of view and his description of the background, which I believe to be accurate. What I would like to add to complete and complement what's just been presented is to present to you what does Russia want? What is Russia asking for? Why are we dealing with this crisis now? Firstly, through Putin, Russia is essentially demanding the end of any expansion projects for NATO in Eastern Europe. They don't want any future expansion which would bring NATO's borders closer to Russia, because NATO is considered to be a threat to Russian decision makers. Another demand is for NATO to remove its troops and the strengthening of its military presence in the new member states of NATO. Essentially, Russia wants NATO to go back to the position that it had essentially when the Cold War was in place. These were the explicit demands. They're unacceptable. Members of NATO can never agree to subject their decisions to any foreign power. This would be as though Russia would be given a veto power over the decisions of NATO member states. So the conditions are impossible to meet, and Russia knows this very well. So what we can ask ourselves is, what does Russia really want? What does Putin really want? Well, if you look at more recent foreign policy, what he's trying to do is to bring Russia back to its glory. It wants it to have a respectable place in an international order. Putin is also trying to protect Russia's interest and the security of Russia. Again, he believes that NATO is a threat to Russia. And so he's trying by every means possible to move this threat away from its borders. He's also trying to preserve its the sphere of influence. Russia is trying to have a buffer space around it. And that would be made up of states that would comply with Russia's demands, in other words, states that are not fully sovereign. The problem with Russia's demands, which are long-standing, they're not recent demands. The problem with these is that this calls into question the international order. In Russia's eyes, they consider that there are two kinds of states in the world, two kinds of nations, those that are sovereign, which theoretically is accepted by the international order. In other words, no foreign power is higher than the particular nation as a nation or as a state. But for Russia, there's that kind of state, but there is also another kind, which are the ones close to it, the states who are former Soviet Union republics. So the 15 republics, 14 others plus Russia, are considered to be part of the near state. And so the former Soviet Union states are not fully sovereign states in Russia's eyes. They must align their foreign policies to the will of Moscow. States which comply with Moscow's will have no problems, and Russia cooperates with them. For example, Kazakhstan. Last month, we saw riots, and they turned to Moscow for troops to help reestablish order. And once order came back, Russia pulled back its troops, no problem. Kazakhstan allies its foreign policy to whatever Moscow wants. But there are other states, such as Georgia, as we saw in 2008, or Ukraine, and others, do not necessarily want to align their foreign policies with Moscow's. And they experience the problems that come as a result of this. Moscow is encouraging secession movements in these states. And that's an easy-to-use tool for Moscow in order to manipulate and pressure these countries. In other words, these states are not fully sovereign. Mr. Jolicoeur?
Can you wind up in a minute or two?
D'accord. Alors, pour conclure.
So in conclusion, I would say that the current crisis seems to be somewhat artificial. Russia is noting the will to extend NATO, but the last promise to this effect dates back to 2008. So why have a crisis now? This seems to be a manufactured, artificial crisis manipulated by the Russian authorities. Why now? Well, Russia seems to consider that Ukraine's wish to turn to the West is something that's going to increase and continue. Ukraine's security forces are getting stronger thanks to training by Canada and other contributing countries who have assisted Ukraine, and militarily with weapons as well that have been sent to Ukraine. So Russia feels relatively strong because they've just completed military reform. So if Russia were to intervene, I'm not saying that they have to, but if they were to, it's better to do it now than later. I would end with that.
We now turn to the first round of questions. They are 6 minutes each. The Conservative have the first 6 minutes, Mr. Ruff, and then Mr. Fisher, and then Madame Normandine, and then Ms. Matheson. So in that order, Mr. Ruff, you're on for 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Chair. So, look, just subbed in here, so I'm getting caught up. Fortunately, for the witness's sake, I do have a little bit of background experience with the Canadian Armed Forces, having just retired after 25 and a half years a couple years ago, and been involved in some initial discussions when we were standing up the Op Unifier mission. So, look, I guess my first question will be to both witnesses. I like both your perspectives. Can you give us a probability or what the chances are you think that the Russians will actually conduct a land excursion into Ukraine?
Alors, je peux commencer si.
I can begin if you wish. To my mind, there are 6 possible scenarios. 6 kinds of action that Russia could undertake. I will list them for you, and I will assess their likelihood. I'll do this quickly. Scenario 1, Russia will do nothing. It was all bluff. I believe that this scenario is unlikely. Putin has set the bar very high with his demands. He wants very specific things from NATO member states, and he has refused to compromise to date. On the contrary, he seems to be increasing the level of his demands. In other words, I have the impression that he cannot pull back without losing face. So that's scenario 1. Second scenario, limited intervention in Donbass. Maybe Russia will try to do what it did with Georgia. In other words, encourage secessionist movements, and then ultimately potentially recognize the independence of these territories. That's a possibility. It's highly likely, to my mind, because Russia has already used the scenario in the past. It's not expensive. It's not costly for Russia, other than exposing itself to additional sanctions. But the international community is not particularly inclined to intervene to liberate these territories. The work would lie with Ukraine. Then the third scenario is a variant of the second scenario, which is to extend secessionist territories. In other words, there are 2 secessionist territories, but they don't occupy all of their provinces as designated in the administrative structure of Ukraine. So Russia could come and assist these 2 territories to broaden the control of these territories that they're currently occupying. The sound was lost. And to my mind, this is an unlikely scenario. Scenario 4, limited intervention to the south and east of Ukraine. In this case, Moscow's will would be to have territorial continuity between the secessionist territories in Donbass and Crimea. And this would give Russia an opportunity to have territorial continuity along the south of Ukraine. This is somewhat probable. Scenario 5, intervening in a part of Ukraine in the west to extend to the Dnieper River, separating Ukraine in half. So the east would be occupied militarily by Russia. This is a somewhat probable scenario. Russia has the military capacity to do it. They're amassed now, and they could technically be able to do this. Sixth scenario, intervening to take all of Ukraine. I believe that this is an unlikely scenario. It's not completely to be excluded, but I believe that it's unlikely. And finally, a general anti-NATO intervention. But to my mind, this is out of question. Out of the question, Russia does not want to start a third world war.
Minutes, Mr. Ruff. You're on mute.
Sorry, I was just saying thanks to the professor. Please, if we get the other witnesses' take.
Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for your service, Mr. Ruff, as well, especially with Operation Unifier. I think those scenarios are should be taken seriously. I would say that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, and we've seen Russia wage a war in eastern Ukraine. Pretend to have a hybrid kind of invasion of Crimea, which ended up being a real invasion of Crimea, illegal annexation, Georgia, Moldova, the list can go on. So I think, people have been asking me about the percentages. I think 100% we need to take seriously the 130,000 troops that they've got in Belarus and, on all three kind of borders of Ukraine. 100% we need to take the threats that Putin is making in the media to, NATO, to Canada, to the United States seriously. And I think what we can do as per our recommendation is raise the level of risk that the Russians have, raise their calculation, change their calculation on what the risk of invading Ukraine would be. The risk was low if Ukraine has nobody supporting it and as part of an alliance. The risk is now being raised by the United Kingdom and the United States and other allies, as I've noted. So I think that's the most important thing that we can do in this situation.
Thank you. I believe my time's up there, Chair.
It is indeed. With that, I'll turn to Mr. Fisher. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. One moment while I let my dog out.
You got to mean this is a real committee. Yes.
You gotta know that could be the worst possible timing ever for a dog to tap at the door to want to get out. Mr. Chair, I want to thank both of our panelists for being here today, for sharing their expertise and also their incredibly valuable time in a very volatile time in our history. I'll tell you, it's very good to be back on the National Defense Committee. I served from 2015 to 2019. I want to be very clear when I say that Canada is a friend to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian people. I was fortunate, blessed with the ability and the opportunity to visit Ukraine a few years ago with this very committee, met with some amazing people, met with some locals, met with some world leaders. And I have to tell you that it was one of the finest visits I've ever made. As you know, Canada has clearly condemned Russia's continued threats and buildup of their military around Ukraine. And although we're all calling for and hoping for a diplomatic solution, we have other tools in the tool chest. And as the ministers have said, any further aggression on the part of Russia will be met with consequences. Now, I'd like to talk about Operation Unifier, which our government has just extended and we're expanding. When it comes to Ukraine's armed forces preparedness, how is Unifier, and I guess I'll go to Ihor on this as we've met several times in the past, but how is Unifier helping to prepare Ukraine's defense team for this increasing Russian aggression in the region?
Mr. Fisher's dog seems to be quite anxious to hear that answer.
His mother came home.
Oh, okay.
Great. Well, thank you for and again, it's great to see you virtually here. I've actually had the opportunity with Minister Champagne just the week before the pandemic started. We were in Ukraine at the base in Western Ukraine, Yavodyo, where we saw in action the Canadian, American, I think there were Swedish and Danes there. So Operation Unifier certainly has been bringing in other bilateral and NATO allies to help Ukraine, and it's the largest permanent mission, I believe, that it operates on Ukrainian territory. And I think it speaks to the trust. Obviously, the expansion of that mission speaks to the trust and the deep relationship between the armed forces. And I would say, as I'm sure many of you have heard, from the returning rotations that we see coming back from the Canadian Armed Forces, they tell us that they have learned as much as they have been training the Ukrainians. They've learned about hybrid warfare. They've learned about the technology. They've learned with admiration about the battles and the real cost of the war that Russia is waging, because they are talking to these soldiers that have served in those front lines. So all of that being said, again, we think that the extension and expansion, of Operation Unifier is wonderful. I do think, though, we have to realize that that is a medium to long term goal for in terms of a program. Right now, obviously, Minister Anand has announced that even now, before an invasion has begun, that those soldiers have been moved back to the west of the Dnipro River to safer positions in Western Ukraine. And unfortunately, I think we all realize that the minute an invasion begins, that for their own safety, we would be evacuating Canadian soldiers and missions. So I think that Unifier is important, but as we're saying today, the defensive weapons is something that would make an immediate impact and remain behind in that case of an invasion. Thank you.
Okay, so in my opening, I talked about other tools in the tool chest, and we've made it very clear, the ministers have made it very clear that we're willing to take further steps should Russia continue this aggression. Strong sanctions, I think the minister said, are at the ready and can be instigated within half a day's notice. Now, I know that Ukraine has asked for defensive weapons or lethal aid. Tell us more, if you can, Ihor, about what these shipments would mean for Ukraine's readiness. And is there the possibility of these shipments causing further escalation of the situation with Russia?
Thanks for the question. I think, again, 2-3 weeks ago, we saw there was a shift in the position of Ukraine's partners and allies, both bilaterally and NATO. Everybody was holding off doing anything because there was a concern that any action would be Russian provocation. And then we saw a shift, starting with the United Kingdom, then the United States. I've lost track of how many plane loads of ammunition and missiles have been sent by those allies, and then the growing list of countries, yesterday Poland and Denmark. So I think that all of that gear, all of that kit, it does several things. It is morally important for Ukrainians to know that they have literal aid, for their own self-defense from these partners all over the world. It is technologically advanced gear that they don't necessarily have. So there's an element of that. We need to remember that nobody hopes to use this defensive equipment. That this is kind of the worst case scenario if Russian tanks or Russian were to cross the border, Russian airplanes were to bomb, God forbid, major cities or infrastructure in Ukraine. So helping Ukraine to defend itself, I think, actually extends, as you said, the work of Operation Unifier. We're there to help Ukrainians defend themselves. There's no ask to send, combat troops from Canada or anywhere else. That's never been anything that Ukraine has asked for. So I think, again, the sanctions are important. We're pushing for sanctions now. I mean, it's very clear that Putin keeps adding more and more of his military personnel to the deployment. And so we think he should be facing some consequences now, as opposed to the day after or the afternoon after he decides that he should. Yeah.
Unfortunately, Mr. Fisher, that's it for your time. With that, we'll turn to
Thank you.
Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Moi aussi, j'aimerais.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd also like to thank our two witnesses for your presence here. You've really prepared the way for our study and review. It's most appreciated. I have questions first from Professor Jolicoeur. I'd like to hear what you have to say about the various threats that Russia can make towards Russia, direct threats, and also perhaps the likelihood of these threats being carried out. Thank you, Madame Normandin, for that question. Threats to Canada can take various forms. As I see it, if Russia considers that Canada's support for Ukraine is casus belli, a cause of conflict, then Russia could undertake a series of actions, either directly or indirectly. Threats to Canada could be in the form of cyber attacks. We know that Russia has not hesitated in the past to use this form of action to intimidate other states. So Canada could be subject to a cyber attack. Beyond cyber attacks, there could be there's a direct infrastructure attack or to attack on our government institutions via cybernetics. Russia could also organize an information campaign or information activities or misinformation, to have propaganda, to denigrate Canada's efforts, or to undermine Canada's social fabric so that the people of Canada would disagree with the decisions being made by its own government. These are kinds of threats that it would be easy for Russia to execute, and I believe that this is not only a highly likely scenario, but I think they've already begun. Another kind of threat that Russia could bring to play against Canada is this. There could be a threat to Canadian territorial integrity. There could be an attack. I believe this to be unlikely. I don't think that Russia wants to expand the theater of operations. Canada is not the main player in Russia's eyes. It could be tempting to take a little state such as Canada. I say little in that we don't have the same power as the U.S. or France or the UK, obviously. So perhaps Russia would want to correct Canada and teach us a lesson. But I believe this is an unlikely scenario because Canada is a member of NATO. And an attack on Canada would mean that all of the NATO's members would have to return the fire, and I don't think Russia wants to expose itself to that kind of a threat. Another form of threat would be to use the Russian community in Canada. Russia could try to manipulate the Russian-speaking or Russian national communities in Canada. This policy would target the Russian communities in the former USSR states. For further away communities, Russia has ways of communicating with them and influencing them using various press and TV stations, RT, the former Russia Today, or Sputnik, or other communication channels. Russia could use those channels in an attempt to spread misinformation, to mobilize or to influence the Russian community. I believe that the Russian community in Canada is much smaller than the Ukrainian community in Canada. Another threat that Russia could use is to manipulate Canada's Ukrainian community to reduce the solidarity with the actions of the Canadian government. I believe this to be unlikely. It's likely that Russia would attempt to do this, but the capacity is limited to influence the Ukrainian community, which is nearly unanimously, not completely, but nearly unanimously engaged behind the effort to support Ukraine. Russia could also attack Canadian troops, not in Canada, but those which are in Eastern Europe, involved in unifier or reassurance. Canada has deployed troops to support the NATO member states who are near Russia, who feel threatened by Russia's behavior. So Russia could attempt to strike at these troops. But if Russia were to do this, it would not be kinetic with armed military attack, but rather by using information or disinformation campaigns or propaganda campaigns. And this is something that's already underway, so it's more than likely. 30 seconds, Madame Normandin. Thank you. I have barely any time to ask another question without time for any answering, so I'll wait for the next round. Thank you.
See, Madame Matheson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. There's been a lot of talk, of course, about the increase of the provision of lethal weaponry from Canada and the potential of that. Of course, so New Democrats are not for that. We want to find the most diplomatic, the most peaceful, deterrent way forward. But potentially, could both witnesses talk about why some of those diplomatic ways forward have not been successful thus far, and I tend to believe, and if this is true, that would be great to hear it from the witnesses as well, but that Canada has failed to provide the supports in terms of the diplomatic corps that it needs to, in terms of the international aid that it needs to, so that we find ourselves down many years, into more of a crisis than we need to. And I think, just for time's sake, if you could also answer the question, with that support or with that ask from Canada for lethal weaponry, it has been suggested that there are plane loads, and I think Ihar said that he lost track of the planes of ammunition that have been received or sent by the U.S. and the U.K. Why is that not enough? Clearly the United States and the Brits, they have far more capacity than Canada to provide that lethal weaponry. Why is that not enough?
To whom did you direct the question? Is it to Ukrainian Congress? We'll
I
start
can,
with them first. Yeah.
Great. I can partially answer, and I was taking notes from the last answer. I mean, I think that Russia is doing all of those things on disinformation. This committee has seen cyber attacks on global affairs. We know Russia is our northern neighbor. They are actively running a disinformation campaign. Fortunately, our community works with the smaller Russian community here who have fled and escaped Putin's Russia, who want to live in a place where there are human rights and freedom of expression. So the answer, I think that in terms of lethal defensive weapons and diplomacy, what we have seen, as Dr. Jolicoeur has laid out in the last several weeks, has been bad faith diplomacy. The Russian Federation has come to the table with outrageous, undeliverable demands on, I believe they wanted Poland and all the Baltic states kicked out of NATO. Putin has a vision which is back to the USSR, which is redrawing the borders of Europe to his liking, and I would say Eurasia, and we shouldn't entirely disbelieve his interest in Canada's north as well. I think that Putin understands force, and in this scenario, provision of lethal weapons is something we hope nobody will ever have to use, but provision of lethal weapons actually increases the seriousness for which the diplomacy may be taking place with the Russian Federation and NATO in this scenario. They build a seriousness of response and mean that Ukraine is not alone in that scenario. In terms of the question that was asked about why the current aid is not enough, I think that we saw yesterday the Canadian flag was part of a group of flags that was raised in Ukraine's parliament, and so Canada, while the Operation Unifier mission is important, it is very significantly noted that Canada has not joined the list of countries, particularly NATO ally countries, which are providing these kinds of military defenses. And so I think, for the ensuring of Canada's good reputation in Ukraine and within our NATO alliances, we believe that whatever can be done should be done. I don't have a list from either country country. I just know that our armed forces certainly work closely together and have a trusted, secure relationship, and they know what could be done in terms of immediate steps. Thank you.
You have about a minute and a half.
OK. Alors, je me permettrai de compléter. Je partage la...
So I could add to this. I agree with the other witnesses' analysis. I believe that Vladimir Putin Unfortunately, the sound has cut out. Unfortunately, negotiation is not being done in good faith. Understanding that NATO member states cannot meet his requirements, I think one could question his true intentions or the true intentions of current Russian authorities. I think that if we could offer Russia something, it may be able to save face and then withdraw its current pressures on the borders of Ukraine. But I think this would be abdicating on sovereignty, and I think this would be sending the wrong message. What I could also note is this. The US, the UK, and other states are currently providing weapons either directly to Ukraine or are strengthening NATO's military presence around Ukraine so as to strengthen the security around this and in states around Russia as well. This is the kind of action that Canada can take. I believe the current state of the Canadian forces is such that we cannot mobilize much more. We can't deploy much more than what's in Ukraine currently. I think that Canada is doing what it can to support Ukraine, but sending additional troops would be difficult.
If we're going to get to a full second round, it's going to have to be fairly smartly executed. So we'll get started on it, and I need some guidance from the Liberal Party as to who the third questioner might be in the event that we get there. So we'll start with Mr. Doherty and Madame O'Connell. 5 minutes each, please. Mr. Doherty.
Just want to be clear. Do you support Canada's providing lethal weapons, lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine?
C'est une très bonne question.
Excuse me again. Apparently, the sound connection is cutting in and out with you. The suggestion is that you turn off your camera and respond. So if you turn off your camera, we'll see whether we get a better sound. Thanks. Okay.
Alors, j'espère que le pour la question à Monsieur Doherty.
I hope the sound is better. Thank you, Mr. Doherty. Thank you for the question. Do I agree with the idea of Canada sending lethal weapons to Ukraine? This is possible. Canada does have some technology available that it could use and could be used profitably by Ukraine, and which could increase the cost of any future Russian military intervention in the Ukraine. For example, drones or other lethal weapons. Canada does have some industrial capacity. However, this would put Canada into the same situation as the UK and the US. In Russia's eyes, these are states that are supporting Ukraine considerably, and this would expose Canada potentially to further intimidation by Russia. If Canada is ready to deal with what this means to have Russia behave this way towards Canada, then yes, Canada could.
Thank you for that. And to either witness here to chime in if they can, what challenges do Russia's gray zone tactics, actions intended to gain advantage that fall below the threshold of war, just pushing to the brink, pose for NATO countries?
I can just answer briefly. We've seen them become experts in this, and I think that's what I was talking about in the earlier answer in terms of what Canadian forces through Op Unify are learning from their Ukrainian comrades. It is how those false flag operations, how the Crimean little green men scenarios are rolled out in ways that are not traditional, kind of, I don't know what the proper military term is, but not the traditional combat that we might have imagined. And again, Ukrainian armed forces have learned to adapt, and I've seen again firsthand at the operational center are interacting with the Ukrainian armed forces, and frankly, again, with that list of countries that I read that are supplying weapons, all of those countries have smaller, albeit smaller missions. They're there as well to learn and to share technology, and I think we need to understand that our contribution of lethal defensive weapons is part of that, is a very meaningful and symbolic and important part of our military and security relationship with Ukraine bilaterally.
Professor Jolicoeur?
Alors, je n'ai pas vraiment de...
I don't really have anything to add to what my predecessor has just said. We can proceed with another question.
Do either of you support the former commanding officer of Melanie Lake of Operational Unifier in her statement where she says we need to stop talking about Russian invasion of Ukraine as inevitable, get a steady stream of world leaders and diplomats flowing through Kiev continuously between now and spring? Run the clock. Russia can't afford to keep that many forces at such high readiness indefinitely.
Again, I can chime in briefly. We were very pleased to have Colonel Lake on our briefing. I think Russia has and is invading Ukraine, and there is a war now. This is a further invasion. So just that's one of the main points I've been making everywhere where I'm speaking. And again, I think the cost for Russia, so financial cost of keeping 130,000 forces out and about, and paid and equipped and fed and all the rest of it, that can be very high. But if we implement sanctions now, that will be higher. That the sanctions on the Russian military officials and Putin's inner circle can increase the cost to the Russian Federation at this time.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, Mr. Doherty. I'm running a clock here.
Thank you.
Madam O'Connell, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for coming. I wanted to follow up on some of the questions that were asked by multiple members already. In terms of the support for sending lethal weapons or the request for sending lethal weapons, I'm not sure, just in the interest of time, if your answers were short, but I almost got the impression that of course these weapons could be useful, but it was also about sending the message that Canada is doing everything. But are there actually specific, and again, if your statements need to be clarified on that, I would appreciate it, but are there specific lethal weapons or technology that the NATO allies have not been able to provide that you would like Canada to provide, or that the Ukrainian government would like Canada to provide? And what are those specifics? Or is it about sending that message? Because in fairness, I think Canada has been there for years, and we've talked about the different operations as well as Operation Reassurance, which is about the surrounding countries as well. So could I just maybe get some more specificity around your comments on lethal weapons, and are there specific gaps that you'd like Canada to fill, or is this about a continuation of sending an even stronger message?
I went first the last time. Maybe Professor Jolicoeur wants to start.
Alors, je pense que...
Well, I think for the time being, Canada is trying to avoid overcommitting itself, and we can understand why. Does Canada have the necessary weapons to be able to strengthen the military capacity of Ukraine? The Ukraine has to draw up a specific list. I referred earlier to drones. I know that Canada does have this capacity in its technology. We know that some drones built in Turkey, but with some Canadian technology, have been used admirably in a recent conflict in the Caucasus, in Nagorno-Karabakh. in the spring of 2020. This is the kind of weaponry which can make a difference in a theater of operations, and something for which Canada has indirectly via Turkey been involved in a recent conflict. So that kind of technology could be sent to Ukraine and could help the Ukrainian armed forces to strengthen their military capacity. Other than that, I am not familiar enough with the kind of weaponry that the Ukraine needs.
I can just say briefly to add to that, again, these lists exist and the armed forces of both countries have been reviewing them for a number of months, if not longer. What I've been told generally is that Canada obviously specializes and has a large land and sea border. And so any kind of surveillance systems that we could be sharing with them would be particularly useful in terms of detecting are going to invade. And so we have a specialty in that, and particularly in the high tech sector. And so it's all about, as you said, putting a higher cost on the Russian calculation to invade. And we know that the trusted relationship between the two armed forces means that those discussions are ongoing at a very secure level.
Thank you for that clarity. Just on a follow-up, would that surveillance technology, especially for land and sea, for example, would that be considered lethal defense weapons? Again, we keep getting asked for the specific lethal weapons. And then just as an example, if land and border surveillance, I would think, again, have been working with the forces there, would that fall into the lethal category?
Again, I can't speculate on the exact names of the kind of systems. I can just say the Ukrainian army and the Canadian army have clear communication on what they need and what can be used. And so I would just have to leave it at that in terms of my comments.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay,
like I said, if we're being asked for lethal, it doesn't sound to me that surveillance would be considered lethal. So I was just trying to get a little bit of clarification then on what the specific ask is and that determination. In terms of...
regrettably, I'm going to have to cut you off, Ms. Connell.
Thank you.
2.5 minutes, Madame Normandy.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'd like to continue with Professor Jolicoeur. You talked about various intervention possibilities for Canada, and a lot was said about sending weapons, and a little bit was said about the potential for military intervention and the associated risks with that. I'd like to hear what you have to say about other intervention possibilities, for example, economic sanctions, increasing support through operations such as Unifier. And perhaps you could tell us, in terms of the risk gradient and the impacts also that any of these could have on the conflict. Hello, Ms. Normandin. Thank you for the question. The kind of sanctions or actions that Canada can undertake to increase pressure on the Russian authorities, without necessarily having to act in Ukraine itself, could be, for example, additional economic sanctions. It would be possible to identify Russian personnel, oligarchs, for example, or people who are close to Vladimir Putin, or even Putin himself. And increased sanctions freeze their economic assets. Obviously, these major Russian fortunes are not necessarily deposited in Canada. They tend to be in London or in other banking systems outside Canada. But certainly this kind of economic sanctions, the freezing of assets and increasing economic pressure on Russia, is something that is within the realm of activities that Canada could undertake without too many consequences, but which would increase the impact and is highly probable. Canada must not act alone, but in coordination with the other NATO members and Ukraine in order to coordinate simultaneous efforts so that they are consistent. Also, we could increase support and funding for Ukraine if we don't want to deploy troops. We could support the Ukrainian government with financial contributions. We could also send weapons, including lethal weapons. These are all possible steps that Canada could take.
Normandine, Mr. Matheson, 2.5 minutes, please.
Actually, I'm just going to pick it right back up from what
Okay, well,
Madame
that's good.
Normandin.
There's a good line of questions.
There. So I would like to hear as well from Ihor about the sanctions and what supports Canada has talked about using those potentials. Even just today, one of the committee members said we're ready and willing, and I'm not sure what's holding that back. And Mr. Zelliker, you had said that the NATO allies have to coordinate those sanctions. So maybe both of you could quickly talk about those.
I mean, I'll just say quickly, sanctioning Russian oligarchs through the Magnitsky legislation is something we can do more of. We can certainly step up to do more. For example, we know people like Oleg Sentsov who were these are Ukrainian political prisoners who were taken into the Russian domestic system. He's the most well-known and was released, but there's many hundreds of others. And those people are prosecuted and jailed by specific people within the Russian Federation. So those kind of personal sanctions, which mean that those individuals and their families can no longer travel or participate in financial transactions in the West, are what we think would make a real difference. And again, we appreciate Canada's commitment to sanctions, but we're saying that we have not matched the strength of the American and EU allies on that in the last number of years.
Alors, pour compléter la réponse.
To complete this answer, I could say that the importance of coordinating with member states of NATO is that if additional sanctions are adopted, it's not just Canada who would pay the price, but our European allies. You have to understand that, on the other hand, if we prevent imports of energy from Russia, that means that the European market is the market for oil and gas from Russia. That would put pressure on Russia, but it would also put a lot of pressure on the European countries who would be subject to the consequences of this. Do we have partners who could replace Russia as a source of energy? Maybe Canada can make some efforts in this direction, but we are having difficulty exporting our oil resources because we don't have the pipelines necessary. This is an old issue in Canada, so we have to find some other way.
To leave it there, I feel badly.
Okay.
It seems it's a role in my life to cut off professors, so I apologize to you, Professor Jolliker. Final two questions, Madame Gallant, 5 minutes, and then Mr. Zuberi, 5 minutes.
Am I third speaker? Should I let that?
Well, that's what it says here.
Okay, well, that's fine. First of all, Mr. Michael Shishin, you had mentioned false flags, and in the news this week, we had our state broadcaster say that the Russians were behind the truckers on Parliament Hill right now. They were calling it a plot by the Russians. How likely is it that they are behind these people who seem to be grassroots individuals there for their own causes?
I would say that RT and Sputnik are the two of the state-owned Russian channels, Canada, both on cable and online, and they sow a lot of disunity and disinformation on Western democracies, and they are what we believe to be state-sponsored media, and we would urge this committee, and we've talked to other committees, to change the ways that those are allowed to broadcast within Canada, because I think that they are trying to undercut our parliamentary democracy in many, many ways, as well as the other covert, kind of media operations that might be going on. But really, we think that going after the state-sponsored media of the Russian Federation is the most powerful way to ensure that there's good information about Canada and around the world.
Okay, it was actually our CBC who was making that report, but Russia Today, have they had any involvement lately in Canada, from your perspective, in terms of riling up the Russian population with respect to Ukraine?
I'm fortunate that I don't have to watch much Russia Today, but I do know that in the past they've gone and done things like harass our community leaders at their homes and community centers and perpetuated some of the false disinformation narratives when they send quote unquote reporters out to Canada. So unfortunately, fortunately, I don't have any current examples because I'm too busy speaking with you and with other Canadians that I don't have to watch RT, but maybe the professor has some other comments on that.
Thank you. And Mr. Doliker, do you have any idea, or since the past past actions are sort of a prediction, with respect to the timing of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, should they decide to start to take land? Twice now was during the Olympics, and we have the Olympics just starting recently. Do you predict that it is fairly imminent? And that's for Mr. Jolicoeur as well.
Alors, merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. I think in terms of the timing of a potential intervention, I think that Russia is going to want to spare the Chinese authorities and wait to after the Olympics if there's going to be military action. But Vladimir Putin has gotten us used to being surprised by him. The anti-Georgia intervention in 2008 was during the Olympics in China. So the war in August 2008 took place when the international community's attention was turned to Beijing. Would this scenario be repeated? I can't say, but I would be surprised. I think that Russia is trying to spare China because China is a very important source of support for Russia right now. So much so, in fact, that if there were to be sanctions and let's say the energy supply from Russia to Europe were to be cut, China would be the best partner to help Russia bear the economic brunt of this. So I think that Russia is trying to preserve China and spare it from any of this. Russia is a master of disinformation. RT and Sputnik are the main vehicles that Russia uses to try to influence behavior of Canadians and Russian Canadians as well as other Canadians. It is possible that news stations such as CBC end up repeating news from RT. It's possible that Russia is to a certain extent behind support for the truckers, indirectly.
Question, Mr. Zuberi, welcome to the committee.
Thanks for having me. So I'd like to put forth this first question concerning Canada's role in NATO, the NATO Operation Resurgence, and how that compares to other NATO nations.
Did you direct that to?
So ça c'est pour Monsieur Jolicoeur.
That's for Mr. Jolicoeur.
Clear to me. So to what extent?
With respect to Operation Reassurance, yes, and Canada's, our country's role within NATO, and how other NATO countries are involved in this operation as it relates to Central Eastern Europe. If you have any, if you'd like to shed light on that, I'd be happy to hear you on this point.
Oui, alors c'est important pour le.
It's important for Canada to be part of these missions. And it's a priority because NATO member states are the ones who benefit from the support. For Canada, it's important to support Ukraine, and there is a large Ukrainian community in Canada. So from both points of view, Canada must support this. I think that the other NATO partners, particularly U.S. I know that additional troops were announced today for Eastern Europe, but care was taken to not place any additional U.S. soldiers in Ukraine so as to avoid upsetting Russia and increasing pressure. Russia is looking at the U.S. It's not Ukraine. It's not about NATO. It's really the U.S. that Russia's targeting. And the U.S., I think, is doing well to avoid placing U.S. soldiers there. But if there were to be U.S. soldiers in Ukraine, that would increase pressure on Russia considerably, more than whatever Canada could do.
Thank you. Merci, Monsieur Jolicoeur. Et une deuxième
Thank you, Mr. Jolicoeur. I have a second question.
To Canada's strengths, how do you feel that we're leveraging them when we compare to the collective of the NATO alliance? How are we leveraging our strengths and expertise in addressing the issue of the conflict? I don't know if that came on through.
I assume you're addressing that to Professor Jolicoeur?
Yeah, Mr. Jolicoeur,
But
exactly.
I'm not getting any sound from Professor Jolicoeur.
D'accord, j'avais des problèmes de son. Donc...
I had some sound problems. Sorry, could you repeat the question?
With respect to our Canada's expertise and our capacities, and if you look at the NATO alliance, are we leveraging our expertise and capacities in a productive way, in a useful way, when it comes to NATO's involvement in Ukraine and the region?
Merci pour la question. Alors,
Thank you for the question. I think that Canada is doing everything that it can, given its military capacities. We already have forces deployed all over the world. And in Canada, we are currently suffering from a shortage in CAF personnel. Canada could contribute somewhat more, but I do think that there are limits to Canadian military capacity at this time. I think that Canada will be very close to this limitation on potential deployment. I think Canada is doing what it can of the resources it has at this time. I think Canada is doing what it can to support Ukraine and the NATO member states.
And dernière question.
And a last question.
Territorial expansion and Russia's intent to destabilize the region. Do you see in this conflict Russia's involvement in Ukraine? Is there an attempt to expand territorially, in fact, to destabilization there in the region? Again, Mr. Jolicoeur.
D'accord. Merci encore une fois pour la question.
Thank you again for the question. I think this is a possibility. But what's most important to Russia is to destabilize Ukraine. What's important to Russia is Crimea, and Russia's gotten Crimea. The international community has passed sanctions, but is not really doing anything to change the situation. Does Russia wish to extend territory further? That is possible, but I think it's a minor possibility. What Russia wants is to destabilize Ukraine, to avoid more democracy there, and to avoid having it become a member of NATO. And so long as there's conflict at the gates of Ukraine, Ukraine will not be able to join NATO. So that's the objective. Thank you.
Mr. Zaberi, Professor Jolicoeur. So that brings our first hour to a close. I want to, on behalf of the committee, thank Mr. Mikulasian and Professor Jolicoeur for an outstanding start to this study. Very, very informative, and I just want to thank you on behalf of the committee. With that, we'll suspend for a minute or two while we re-empanel.
Thank you.